The Sahara stretched endlessly, a sea of golden waves rippling under the unrelenting sun. Our convoy moved cautiously across the dunes, its roar swallowed by the oppressive silence of the desert. I was still trying to process the sheer absurdity of what had brought us here. A gateway? Hidden in one of the most remote and unforgiving places on Earth? It sounded like a fever dream, but the funding was real, the satellite images undeniable, and the artifact recovered from the site, well, that was another matter altogether. Dr. Ilara Quinn, our lead archaeologist and the one person who seemed immune to doubt, sat beside me in the armored vehicle. Her hand clutched the strange metallic tablet, the artifact that had set this expedition in motion. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, glyphs appearing and disappearing like ghosts. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even though the sight made my stomach churn. "We're close," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the tension that gripped the team. "Another mile, maybe 2. I glanced out the window. The dunes seemed endless, but something about the horizon felt wrong. A faint shimmer hung in the air, like heat haze, but denser, darker. I could feel it more than I could see it, an inexplicable pressure in the back of my mind. "Does anyone else feel that?" I asked, my voice tight. "Feel what?" said Russ, our ex-military security chief, from the front seat. I struggled to find the words. "Like, we're being watched." No one answered, but the silence was telling. We all felt it. Minutes later, we crested a massive dune, and there it was, the gateway. It wasn't what I had expected, no ancient stone archway or weathered ruins. Instead, it was a massive structure of obsidian-black material, perfectly smooth and untouched by time. It jutted out of the sand at an angle, as if thrust there by some cataclysm. The air around it shimmered and pulsed, and the pressure in my head grew unbearable. The convoy came to a halt. The team scrambled out, gear in hand, but no one spoke. We were all transfixed by the monolithic anomaly before us. Ilara was the first to break the silence. "It's alive," she whispered, almost reverently. Russ snorted. "Alive? It's a damn rock." But even as he said it, the glyphs on the artifact flared brighter, matching the rhythm of the shimmering air. It wasn't a coincidence. This thing wasn't just an ancient relic, it was a key. "Ilara, are you sure about this?" I asked, unease creeping into my voice. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, holding the artifact aloft. As she approached the gateway, the shimmering intensified, the pressure in my skull becoming almost unbearable. And then, with a soundless crack that I felt in my bones, the surface of the gateway rippled like liquid. "Ilara, wait!" Russ barked, but it was too late. She stepped through. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the gateway roared to life. A shockwave of energy knocked us to the ground, and the sky above twisted into unnatural hues of violet and green. The sand around the gateway began to shift, spiraling into a vortex that dragged everything toward the structure. "Ilara!" I shouted, struggling to stay upright as the ground quaked beneath me. Without thinking, I lunged toward the gateway. Russ grabbed my arm, but I shook him off. "She's in there!" I yelled. "Then she's gone," he snapped, his face pale with terror. But I couldn't accept that. Heart pounding, I gripped the artifact Ilara had dropped and dove into the swirling void. The sensation was indescribable. One moment I was in the desert, the next I was falling through a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and shapes. My body felt like it was being torn apart and reassembled 1,000 times over. And then I was standing on solid ground. The air was thick and cold, filled with an electric hum that vibrated through my chest. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. I was in a vast, cavernous expanse, its walls glowing faintly with veins of pulsating light. Strange, alien structures jutted out at impossible angles, defying every law of physics I thought I understood. "Ilara!" I called, my voice echoing endlessly. No answer. I moved cautiously, every step a struggle against the overwhelming sense of wrongness that permeated the air. And then I saw her. She was standing in the distance, her back to me, staring at something I couldn't see. "Ilara!" I called again, louder this time. She turned slowly, her face pale and her eyes wide with something between awe and terror. "It's not a gateway," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's a prison." Before I could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. The ground trembled, and a shadow passed over us, impossibly large. "Ilara, run!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of whatever was coming. Something was waking up. The roar reverberated through the alien cavern, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead as the shadows twisted and coiled, impossibly vast and incomprehensible. "Ilara, we need to go," I yelled, my voice trembling with desperation. She stood frozen, her gaze fixed on something in the darkness ahead. "It's alive," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum that filled the air. "It's been here for millennia. Waiting. Waiting for what?" I demanded, but she didn't answer. Instead, she took a shaky step forward, as if drawn by an invisible force. I lunged for her, grabbing her arm. "Ilara, snap out of it. We have to leave, now." Before she could respond, the cavern shook violently. The pulsating veins of light along the walls flared brighter, casting the space in an eerie, otherworldly glow. The shadows in the distance began to take shape, and I wished they hadn't. It wasn't just one entity. It was many, hundreds, maybe thousands, massive, serpentine forms that seemed to shift and blur, their edges indistinct, as if they existed halfway between dimensions. Their eyes, if you could call them that, were glowing pinpricks of light, and they were all fixed on us. "Ilara, we have to move," I shouted, tugging her back. This time, she didn't resist. We turned and ran, the cavern stretching endlessly before us. The ground beneath our feet felt strange, almost liquid, but it held firm as we sprinted. Behind us, the creatures stirred, their guttural cries growing louder. The air itself seemed to ripple with their movements, and the hum intensified, pressing against my skull like a vice. "Where are we even going?" Ilara shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know. Just keep moving." Ahead, the cavern walls began to shift, the glowing veins rearranging themselves as if the space was alive. Doorways and corridors appeared and vanished at random, twisting in impossible directions. It was a maze, and it was changing with every step we took. "We're being herded," Ilara said, her voice shaking. "They're leading us somewhere." I glanced back and immediately regretted it. The creatures were gaining on us, their massive forms undulating through the air like living storms. They weren't just chasing us, they were toying with us, driving us deeper into the labyrinth. Suddenly, the ground beneath us gave way. We fell, tumbling into darkness. My stomach lurched as we plummeted, the air rushing past us in a deafening roar. Just when I thought we would hit bottom, the fall slowed, as if the air itself had thickened, cradling us in its grip. We landed softly, the impact barely jarring. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me. We were in another chamber, smaller than the first but no less alien. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, glyphs that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them. In the center of the room stood a massive, obelisk-like structure, its surface covered in the same pulsating light as the cavern walls. "Ilara," I said, my voice trembling. "What is this place?" She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the obelisk. "It's ancient," she murmured. "Older than anything we've ever known. This isn't just a prison, it's a tomb." "A tomb for what?" She turned to me, her expression grim. "For gods." Before I could respond, the hum in the air grew deafening. The obelisk began to glow brighter, and the glyphs on its surface flared to life. I could feel the energy radiating from it, a power so immense it made my chest tighten. And then the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing second. Voices in a language I couldn't understand, yet somehow I felt the meaning behind the words. They were calling to us, beckoning. "Ilara, don't," I began, but she was already moving toward the obelisk. "I have to," she said, her voice distant. "This is why we're here. This is what it wanted." What wanted?" I demanded, but she didn't answer. She reached out, her hand trembling as it touched the surface of the obelisk. The effect was immediate. The room exploded with light, and I was thrown backward, slamming into the wall. When I opened my eyes, the obelisk was gone, and in its place stood something else. It was humanoid in shape but impossibly tall, its form shimmering and shifting like liquid metal. Its eyes were voids, endless and consuming. It looked at Alara, then at me, and I felt my mind unraveling under its gaze. "You have awakened me," it said, its voice a chorus of 1,000 tones. "Why?" Alara was trembling, but she managed to speak. "We didn't mean to. We didn't know. Your ignorance is irrelevant," it said. "You have opened the door, and now it cannot be closed." The cavern trembled again, and I realized the creatures we had seen earlier were approaching, their roars echoing through the corridors. "They come to reclaim what was taken from them," the entity said. "But they are too late. The balance has been shattered." "What balance?" I demanded, forcing myself to stand. "What the hell is going on?" The entity turned its gaze on me, and I felt my knees buckle. "Your kind does not belong here," it said. "But now you must choose. Will you fight for your survival, or will you be consumed?" Before I could answer, the walls of the chamber began to crack, beams of light spilling through. The creatures were almost upon us, their guttural cries growing louder. The entity raised one shimmering hand, and a portal opened behind it. "Go," it said. "If you value your lives, go now." "Alara, come on," I shouted, grabbing her arm. She hesitated, her gaze locked on the entity. "This isn't over," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," the entity replied. "It has only just begun." I pulled her toward the portal, the ground shaking violently beneath us. As we stepped through, I caught one last glimpse of the chamber collapsing, the creatures descending upon the entity. And then we were falling again, hurtling through the kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. When we landed, the air was hot and dry. We were back in the Sahara, the gateway standing silent behind us. But something was different. The sky was darker, the sun dimmer, and the pressure in my chest hadn't gone away. "Alara," I said, my voice trembling. "What have we done?" She looked at me, her expression haunted. "We didn't find a gateway," she said. "We found a door. And now it's open." The sun hung low in the sky, dim and unnatural. A veil of ash-like particles drifted through the air, casting an eerie glow over the Sahara. The once scorching desert was now unnervingly cold, the sand beneath our feet brittle, as though the land itself had been drained of life. We stood in silence, staring at the gateway behind us. It had returned to its dormant state, a monolith of obsidian black. No hum, no glow, no signs of the chaos we had just escaped. And yet, the weight in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier. "Alara, we need to destroy it," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was sharp, edged with panic. She shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the structure. "It's too late. Destroying it won't undo what's been set in motion." "What does that even mean?" I snapped. "You heard that thing, it said the balance is shattered. If we don't act now, those things will come through." "They're already here," she murmured. I froze. "What?" Alara turned to me, her face pale, her eyes haunted. "Don't you feel it? The air, the ground, it's not just the gateway that's changed. It's the world." As if on cue, a low rumble echoed across the desert. The sand beneath us began to vibrate, tiny grains shifting in unnatural patterns. I turned toward the horizon and felt my blood run cold. Something was moving toward us. It started as a faint shimmer, barely visible against the hazy sky. But as it drew closer, the shimmer resolved into shapes, massive, undulating forms that seemed to ripple through the air like waves. Their movements were both fluid and jagged, as though they were tearing through reality itself. "The creatures," I whispered. "They followed us." Alara grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "They are not just following us. They are hunting us." I didn't need any more convincing. "Run!" We sprinted across the dunes, the cold air burning our lungs. The creatures were gaining, their roars reverberating through the desert like the toll of a massive bell. I glanced back and immediately regretted it. There were more of them now, dozens, maybe hundreds, their forms shifting and blurring in ways my mind couldn't comprehend. Some slithered across the sand, others hovered, their glowing eyes fixed on us. They didn't move like predators, they moved like conquerors. "Ilara, what do they want?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. She didn't answer. Her focus was ahead, her expression grim. Ahead of us, the terrain began to change. The dunes gave way to a jagged expanse of blackened rock, the air shimmering with heat. In the distance, I could see a cluster of abandoned structures, research stations, relics of long-forgotten expeditions. "There!" I pointed. "We can take cover there." We reached the ruins just as the creatures closed in. The buildings were skeletal, their walls crumbling, but they provided enough shelter to buy us a moment to breathe. "What now?" I panted, leaning against a rusted beam. Ilara was already scanning the area, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "We need to draw them away. If they are focused on us, they'll leave the gateway alone." "That's your plan? To distract an army of interdimensional monsters?" I asked, incredulous. She turned to me, her expression hard. "Do you have a better idea?" Before I could respond, the creatures began to encircle the ruins. Their guttural growls filled the air, vibrating through the ground. One of them, a massive, serpent-like form, slithered closer, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. "Ilara, we're out of time," I said, my voice trembling. She reached into her pack and pulled out the artifact, the metallic tablet that had started this nightmare. The glyphs on its surface were glowing faintly, as if responding to the proximity of the creatures. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "Buying us time," she said. Before I could stop her, she stepped out of cover, holding the artifact aloft. The creatures hesitated, their movements faltering as if they were confused. The serpent-like one let out a low, rumbling growl, but it didn't attack. "Ilara, get back here!" I shouted. But she ignored me. "You want this?" she called out to the creatures. "Then come and get it." With that, she hurled the artifact as far as she could. It landed with a metallic clang on the blackened rock, its glow intensifying. The creatures immediately surged toward it, their movements frenzied. "Ilara, run!" I yelled. We took off again, weaving through the ruins as the creatures converged on the artifact. The air was filled with their guttural cries and the hum of the tablet's energy. But the relief was short-lived. The artifact's glow suddenly flared, brighter than ever, and then it exploded. The shockwave was immense, knocking us off our feet. I hit the ground hard, the breath ripped from my lungs. When I looked up, the creatures were reeling, their forms flickering and unstable. But they weren't retreating. Instead, they began to shift, merging into a single, colossal entity. It towered over the ruins, its form an ever-changing mass of light and shadow. Its roar was deafening, a sound that seemed to pierce straight into my mind. "Ilara, what the hell is that?" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. She didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the colossal entity, her expression one of dawning realization. "It's not just one of them," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's all of them. A hive mind." The entity turned its gaze on us, and I felt the same crushing weight I had felt in the cavern. It wasn't just looking at us, it was inside us, probing, searching. And then, it spoke. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said, its voice a cacophony of overlapping tones. "You have opened the door, and now you must face the consequences." "What consequences?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure if it could even hear me. The entity didn't answer. Instead, it began to advance, its massive form blotting out the horizon. "Ilara, we need to move," I shouted, grabbing her arm. But she didn't budge. "We can't keep running," she said. "We have to stop it." "How?" I demanded. Her gaze shifted to the gateway, visible in the distance. "We need to close the door." The air burned with a static charge as the colossal entity loomed closer, its mass undulating like a storm-given form. Its presence bent reality around it, warping the space between us and the gateway. The guttural, grinding sound of its voice echoed through the ruins, each word reverberating in my chest like the tolling of a funeral bell. "The door must remain open," it intoned. "The balance is no more. You will witness the end. Ilara, we need a plan, I said, my voice trembling with urgency. Her eyes darted between the entity and the gateway in the distance, the jagged silhouette of the obsidian monolith standing stark against the ash-choked sky. The gateway is the key. If we can force it to close, we might be able to contain this thing. How? We don't even know how it works. Ilara hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she didn't have an answer. But then her expression hardened. The artifact. Its energy triggered the gateway. If we can replicate that energy, amplify it, it might force the gateway to seal. Amplify it with what? We don't have anything. She turned to me, her face pale but resolute. We do. The obelisk. It's still there. If I can activate it again. Absolutely not, I cut her off. That thing almost killed us last time. You saw what it unleashed. I know, she snapped. But it's the only chance we've got. The obelisk was designed to interact with the gateway. It's the only thing powerful enough to close it. The ground shook violently, cutting off any further argument. The entity was closer now, its massive form blotting out the ruins. Tendrils of shadow and light extended from its body, probing the air like the limbs of some eldritch beast. We don't have time to argue, Ilara said. She grabbed my arm, her grip firm despite the fear in her eyes. You have to trust me. I looked at her, then at the advancing entity. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But something in Ilara's gaze anchored me. Fine, I said. But we do this together. We broke into a sprint, heading straight for the gateway. The entity roared, a sound that seemed to tear the sky apart, and the ruins around us began to collapse. Chunks of stone and metal rained down, the ground splintering beneath our feet. As we reached the gateway, the obelisk began to hum, faint but unmistakable. The same pulsating glyphs from before flickered to life, as though it recognized us. What now? I asked, my voice tight with panic. Ilara didn't answer immediately. She knelt by the base of the obelisk, her hands moving over its surface, searching for something. The glyphs brightened at her touch, their patterns shifting like liquid. Hurry! I urged, glancing back at the entity. It was nearly upon us, its massive tendrils tearing through the ruins with terrifying ease. I'm trying, she snapped, her focus unyielding. The obelisk responds to energy input, but it's incomplete. I need a power source. A power source? Like what? Her eyes met mine, and I felt a sinking dread. It needs something alive. I stared at her, horrified. No. Absolutely not. It's the only way, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The obelisk draws on life energy to amplify its power. That's how it was designed. Then it can take mine, I said, stepping forward. No, she said, grabbing my arm. It has to be me. You need to stay here. If something happens to me, you have to close the gateway. Ilara, I can't let you. You have to, she cut me off. This is my fault. I activated the gateway. I have to fix it. Before I could argue further, the obelisk's hum grew louder. The glyphs flared brilliantly, casting the desert in an otherworldly light. Ilara placed her hand on its surface, and the glow intensified, wrapping around her like tendrils of fire. Ilara! I shouted, reaching for her. Get to the gateway, she yelled, her voice filled with both determination and pain. Close it before it's too late. The energy around her surged, and the obelisk began to tremble. The air grew thick with power, and the ground beneath us cracked and splintered. I turned toward the gateway, my heart pounding. The monolith was pulsating now, its surface rippling with waves of energy. I reached it just as the obelisk released a blinding surge of light. The entity let out an ear-splitting roar, its form flickering and distorting. It lashed out with its massive tendrils, but the light from the obelisk seemed to repel it, forcing it back. Ilara! I screamed, but there was no response. With trembling hands, I placed both palms on the gateway. The surface was ice-cold, but it seemed to vibrate under my touch, alive with energy. I focused on the obelisk, willing its power to flow through the gateway, to seal the breach. The monolith's glow grew brighter, and I felt a surge of energy course through me. The air was filled with the deafening hum of the obelisk, the roars of the entity, and the crackling of reality itself. And then, everything stopped. The light from the obelisk vanished, plunging the desert into darkness. The entity froze, its massive form shimmering like a mirage. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had halted. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the gateway began to close. The entity let out a final, agonized roar as its form was pulled toward the collapsing breach. Tendrils of light and shadow clawed at the edges of the gateway, but it was too late. With a deafening crash, the gateway sealed shut. I fell to my knees, the sudden silence almost as overwhelming as the chaos had been. The air was still, the ash-like particles settling on the sand. The obelisk was dark, lifeless, its surface cold and unresponsive. "Ilara," I whispered, turning toward where she had been. She was gone. I stumbled to the obelisk, my hands shaking. "Ilara!" I called out, my voice cracking. There was no answer. The desert was empty, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind. I sank to the ground, my chest heaving with sobs. The gateway was closed, the entity banished, but the cost had been too great. The world was safe, for now. But as I stared at the lifeless obelisk, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The gateway had been a door, yes. But doors could always be opened again. And somewhere, in the unfathomable depths of the universe, something was waiting. The end, or perhaps, just the beginning.